All right, is that better? Thanks. If you can't hear, please just wave at the back. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, first of all, and thank you so much for coming out again and showing such interest in the topic of Botha and Jan Smuts. To set the scene this morning and just give you a flavor of Smuts, I thought I'd proceed this talk with a brief 3-minute news clip of the famous occasion in 1943 when Jan Smuts addressed a joint sitting of the British Parliament.
The setting of this unique gathering was a spacious and stately chamber in the heart of London. For the first time, an Empire statesman was to speak to a combined assembly of the Lords and Commons. The arrival of General Smuts in company with the Prime Minister and Mr. Lloyd George was the signal for a great outburst of applause. Then, after a short address, the Father of the House of Commons said,
I call upon Field Marshal Smuts to address you.
I appreciate this honor, which is more than I have deserved, but I accept it as expressing your goodwill to myself personally and to the small country and people whom I have the honor to represent. One occasionally hears idle words about the decay of this country, about the approaching break-up of the great group which we form. What folly and ignorance. What misreading of the real signs of the times. In some quarters, what wishful thinking. Let the enemy say, God strafe England. God bless England has been the response from the victims of this most fiendish onslaught in history. This is its glory, to have stood in the breach and to have kept the way open to man's vast future. And when after a long absence I see today this flame of the Spirit above the flame of the Blitz, I feel that I have come to a greater, a prouder, a more glorious home of the free than I ever learned to know in its palmiest days. Other allied nations, each in its own degree, share in this spirit. Think of China and its 5 years of suffering.
I'll end this talk with the last 3 minutes of that occasion. John Buchan once wrote of Oliver Cromwell that great men lay upon posterity the burden of trying to understand them. Well, posterity has laid upon us the burden of trying to understand Jan Smuts, and he's not the easiest of characters to understand. His trusted Lieutenant Leif Egeland thought that that Smuts' outwardly simple, yet inwardly complex, dynamic, and forceful personality was beyond the capacity of any one biographer or historian to portray. Like a diamond, wrote Egeland, Smuts was extremely hard, had many facets, some of which shone more brightly than others, and I think his political enemies thought that like a diamond he might endure forever. So how does one explain to a modern audience what motivated this most cerebral and dedicated of South African political leaders? What sort of a person was Smuts? What was he like to meet? What was he most interested in? What gave him pleasure and amusement? Why, despite his inverted character and reserved nature, did so many people revere and idolize him and others scorn him? And why, of course, is he largely forgotten, ignored or forgotten today? Now, it's generally agreed that in South Africa's short history, we've produced at least two men of world renown in Smuts and Nelson Mandela. Mandela's reputation, of course, has been preserved and burnished in foundations named after him, books, films, awards, and the like. Smuts has been all but written out of history, both here and abroad. Mandela will forever be honored by the man who brought an end to apartheid. Smuts is accused by posterity of having been instrumental in creating apartheid. So how should Smuts, a believer in segregation, racial segregation, and in white trusteeship over the other races in South Africa, should he, throughout his long life, should he be held responsible for apartheid? Well, the answer to that, I would submit, is partly yes and partly no. But before coming to any conclusion about this vexing question, let me briefly remind you, for those who don't know, of Smuts's extraordinary lifetime achievements. A quick synopsis. He was born in the little Boerland town of Riebeek West in 1870. He was a subject of Queen Victoria's at birth. As a little boy, he herded sheep and goats on his father's farm until sent to school for the first time at the age of 12, where he was soon outstripping his peers intellectually. Matriculating and then graduating with distinction at Victoria College, Stellenbosch, he won the Ebden Scholarship to Cambridge, where he was regarded as one of Cambridge's best law students ever. And the Master of Christ's College, the Nobel Prize winner Lord Todd, in about 1970, rated Smuts alongside Milton and Darwin as one of the college's three most outstanding scholars in its 500-year-old history. Einstein counted Smuts amongst the dozen or so people who understood his theory of relativity. He was in that sort of league intellectually. It was while at Cambridge that Smuts began to develop his philosophy of holism, as he pronounced it, holism, an attempt to explain the workings of the universe and man's place in it, an ambitious attempt. The evolutionary process in its various forms, he asserted, was a constant striving towards the formation of wholes that were greater than the sum of their parts. And you can see this coming through in his politics, the unity between English and Afrikaners, the unification of the provinces in South Africa, and the cooperation between countries in the British Empire, later the Commonwealth, in the League of Nations, and then in the United Nations. He believed the wholeness of an organization being the sum of its constituent parts. And the Commonwealth, he always believed, could serve as a model for the post-World War II world. Well, as his rather cynical parliamentary colleague, Bernard Friedman, who became a prog in the 1950s, reflected, whether this was how Smuts really thought the world worked, or whether it was how he would have run the world had he been the deity himself, is an open question. Certainly, holism seems to have gone into reverse in these days of Trump and Brexit and in the splintered society and world that we seem to be living in today. But I suspect that Smuts, rather like the Chinese, was thinking in terms of centuries rather than decades. As he said in Parliament in 1933, what are a few years on the native question, as it was called? Our grandchildren 200 years hence will still be laboring at the native question. It's our problem. It's the great question that has been entrusted to South Africa, end quotes. Returning to Cape Town after completing his studies at Cambridge to practice law, Smuts was so incensed about Rhodes's treachery over the Jameson raid that he forsook the Cape for the Transvaal, where he became state attorney to Paul Kruger in the ZAR at the tender age of 28. And in the Anglo-Boer War, as you know, he was a self-taught military strategist, a guerrilla fighter, and a commando leader, but one who carried a book by Immanuel Kant and a copy of the Greek New Testament in his saddlebag. As a soldier, he commanded a column in Southwest Africa in World War I, and thereafter was in command of the multinational imperial forces seeking to drive the German army out of East Africa. As a politician, Smuts, of course, was the chief architect of the South Africa we live in today. It was he who effectively decided the country should be a union rather than a federation, he and Merriman, where our three capitals should be, and who should have and should not have the vote. He built up the Union Defence Force in 2 world wars. He served as a member of 2 British war cabinets. He was instrumental in creating the Royal Air Force. He played a leading role in founding the League of Nations, and he helped to enshrine the protection of human rights in the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. No wonder the veteran British diplomat and UN peacekeeper Sir Brian Urquhart described Smuts as one of history's most remarkable eminence greasers. He also, of course, became a great friend of Winston Churchill, who frequently sought his counsel in World War II. Churchill developed a huge regard for Smuts during the 2 world wars, once likening him during a bibulous lunch with Eden and Tedder to Socrates. My faith in Smuts, Churchill told his close colleague Brendan Bracken, and I quote, is unbreakable. And I think in Andrew Roberts' latest book on Churchill, which is 1,000 pages long, but if you get through it, it's well worth reading, he says that the only person besides Clementine Churchill who Churchill ever would listen to for advice or take advice from was Smuts. Throughout his life, Smuts held to the view that the only way to preserve European values on this remote continent, European in quotes values on this remote southern tip of Africa, was to bring white South Africans, Boers and Brits closer together in order to build a strong nation, a strong economy, and improve living standards for all, not only in South Africa, but across the continent. And as Bill Nasson points out, rather like Rhodes, the early pre-World War I Smuts had a vision of a white South Africa leading the way in Africa, laying the foundation of a greater British African Commonwealth. And this soaring ambition was not to leave him until relatively late in life. But it must also be said that Smuts' lifelong willingness to give way on some issues of principle in order either to achieve a desired political outcome or to remain at the center of politics and political power, of which his compromise with Herzog over the Cape African franchise in 1936 was perhaps the most notable example, led to his reputation among his fellow Afrikaners for slipperiness, and hence his nickname of Slim Jannie. So what was Smuts like? Well, besides his intellect, his other outstanding quality was his physical courage. Whether commanding a band of guerrilla fighters in the Anglo-Boer War, flying into enemy-held territory in Africa, confronting striking miners, standing up to thugs at political meetings who bent on harming him physically, or climbing mountains. According to Piet Bierkes, who knew him well, he was totally without fear, physical or mental. His bravery when leading his ragtag commando through hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory in the Cape became the stuff of legend, as did his disregard of danger when flying in wartime in unreliable aircraft in the most hazardous of weather and circumstances. And during the eruption of labor militancy, which engulfed the Rand in 1914, he and Botha intervened personally by driving in an open car to the Carlton Hotel to negotiate with armed members of the strike committee. A year later, during the Boer Rebellion, in which his friend General Adela Ray was accidentally shot by the police, he and Botha again braved the hostility of an Afrikaner nationalist crowd by attending the fallen Boer's funeral ceremony without an escort. As Prime Minister at the time of the Rand Revolt in 1922, Smuts again disregarded all warnings of impending danger and was driven into Johannesburg amid a hail of bullets to see things for himself. His Boer colleague, General Koen Brits, described him as the bravest man he ever met. But here's the paradox. This brave, tough-minded man's man was always more comfortable intellectually and platonically in the company of women. He had a long and satisfying marriage to Isie Krige, another brilliant student of the classics at Stellenbosch, where they met. But throughout his long life, he confided his deepest and most profound spiritual and political thoughts to a succession of women friends. He wrote something between 23,000 and 24,000 letters to women, to the likes of Olive Schreiner, Emily Hobhouse, his Quaker friends, the Clark daughters of Somerset, Princess Frederica of Greece, Lady Daphne Moore, the Brits-born wife of the British governor of Kenya. To women, he would reveal a sensitivity that was often absent from his dealings with men. In person, to those who didn't know him well, Smuts could be most intimidating, especially if interrupted while working. Hancock recounts the experience of one Englishman in the Transvaal Republic in the early days who later became a friend. Smuts received me coldly, he wrote, if not with mistrust. The lean, unsmiling visage, the piercing blue-grey eyes, the quick, impatient speech, which you heard, the frigid bearing of the new state attorney, all were disconcerting. This was no man to suffer fools gladly, or at all. Well, Smuts certainly didn't suffer fools gladly, yet to those close to him, he was a warm and friendly figure. His family, the strongly developed love of family, who lived simply and frugally, as you will know if you've ever been to his Spartan home at Doornkloof. The worst that could be said of him, according to his son, was that he took life a little too seriously. Like many very clever people, he was sometimes impatient with those less quick on the uptake, partially because he was, in his son's explanation, a phenomenally busy person who was lionized but harried also all his life. And if he found it necessary to put the shutters up, well, it was often in sheer self-defense. Yet even members of his own family could be unnerved and tongue-tied in his presence. Visitors to Doornkloof at Irene outside Pretoria wasted his time or asked interminable questions because they couldn't think of what to talk to him about. That bored him, and he would escape from their company as soon as it was politely possible to do so. His impatience lessened, I gather, as the years passed, but it was often tested by his large family. His adopted daughter, Kathleen, described how, as the family grew and the grandchildren started arriving, rooms were added to the austere wood and iron big house at Doornkloof, once a British officers' mess at Middelburg, by enclosing more and more portions of the stoep. Eventually there were 14 bedrooms in the house, some filled by as many as 30 people, a total of 30 people, especially over weekends. And if there was too much noise, Smuts might emerge from his study like Nemesis, according to IC, to complain that the racket was interfering with his work. His mood, according to Kathleen, was the barometer by which the atmosphere in the house was measured. Smuts possessed not only a daunting intellect, but just like Churchill, a photographic memory as well. His family would recall how he could recap whole pages out of books from memory. A senior SAF officer, Major General Kenneth van der Spey, recounted an occasion in East Africa when a British colonel in the mess asked Smuts if it were true that if a few paragraphs of a book were read to him, he could repeat the words accurately. Of course, Smuts replied, whereupon a book was chosen randomly and read to him. After 2.5 pages, he called stop and repeated what had been read without making a single error. And you know, in that respect, Churchill was very similar. He could quote huge swathes of Macaulay and Shakespeare, as if he'd read it yesterday. That was one characteristic, one of many, that the two men shared. Sarah Gertrude Millen, who knew Smuts well, wrote that he once confessed to her that he had little aesthetic feeling and no sense of humour. Well, that was a charming admission, she said, but it did him an injustice. He may not have had much time in his busy life for art, music, or theatre, but he had a very deep love of nature and an ear for good poetry, both in English and German and other languages, Greek being one of them. He certainly had a sense of humour, although it wasn't often revealed. In private, he was supposedly a good raconteur. He liked, like most South Africans, liked Van der Merwe jokes. His wit could be sharp. After one of his frequent absences from home, his IC remarked rather acidly that she hoped she would see more of him in the afterlife than she had in this one. To which he replied gruffly, "It all depends on whether or not we end up at the same destination." What Smuts lacked, according to Millen, was a sense of fun. The things which gave ordinary people enjoyment, like playing and watching sport, cards, dancing, hunting, racing, gambling, going to the theatre, simply didn't interest him. Kathleen Mincher recalls how her husband Paul, he was having a cup of tea on the back stoop. Her husband Paul was swinging a golf club on the lawn while she and the Obars were enjoying a morning chat. And Smuts turned to her and said, "It must be wonderful, Kathleen, to be so simple-minded that one can enjoy a game of golf." I think that's my favourite Smuts story. I shudder to think what he would have said about playing bridge. But he loved exercise, climbing mountains until well into his old age, or striding for long distances across the veldt. Shortly before his 80th birthday, he told an interviewer that his rural background had been a sheet anchor to him throughout his life. "My hobbies have always been walking, plants, and the mountains." Money was never of great interest to Smuts, or so he professed. What he managed to save went into the purchase of land rather than stocks and shares. But during his life, he owned, not together, but at one time or another, about 11 farms. And as long as he owned sufficient property, he felt he could provide for his family's needs from his salary and a generous overdraft from the bank without having to be too concerned about the admonitions of IC, who managed his finances, or his bank manager. And from time to time, he would be given money from grateful organizations or well-wishers, but he was scrupulous in turning these funds over to the public purse. Though never well off, he flatly refused to accept help from wealthy friends who wished to lessen his financial burden at various times. And even when in debt, he would lend money to struggling friends, sometimes large amounts of money, according to his son, not much of which was ever repaid. And ailing Eberly Hophouse in her old age was one such benefactor of his generosity. Another of Smuts' defining characteristics was his self-possession, which was often misconstrued as conceit or arrogance. Pitt Bierkus reckons that one of the flaws in his character was that he was too sure of himself. He had that unwavering belief in the rightness of his cause and in his mastery of events. But yet, so often is the case, a weakness can also be a strength. Alan Paton described Smuts' greatness to those masterminds already having an outstanding intellect who possess the self-confidence of maturity to a sublime degree. And it's precisely this quality in Smuts that commended him, that won him the confidence of so many people and enabled him to lead so effectively. You thought he was always in control of the situation. Kenneth Ingham, another perceptive biographer, this time British, attributes Smuts' self-belief to his superior mind and fundamentally religious sense of purpose. The latter might have been an onerous and often inhibiting burden to carry through life, said Ingham, but in later years Smuts bore it more easily out of a deep-seated belief in his own rectitude. Once he'd thought through a problem and come up with an answer that was rational and satisfied his own conscience, he was often unable to understand why other less intelligent people might think differently. And their failure to do so, he told himself, could only be attributed to stupidity or outright hostility. And after the death of Louis Botha, his great mentor and sounding board, Smuts found himself alone, having to take far-reaching political decisions which he would love to have talked to somebody else about, frequently acting without consultation. And two notable cases in point were his impulsive decision in 1924, after his party had lost a by-election at Wakkerstroom, to call a general election. His colleagues warned him that the government he headed, had become so unpopular that he risked not only losing the election, but his own seat as well. And they were proved right. Once more, in the calamitous election of 1948, he disregarded all warnings from his caucus about party strategy, saying, "I won't allow further discussion on this matter. There can be no questioning of my leadership. I will not allow the caucus to dictate to me." As Prime Minister, Smuts was often a committee of one, never shy of taking responsibility. The perfection which his conscience demanded meant that he was the only one allowed to measure himself. His friends and colleagues, with the notable exception of J.H. Hofmeyr, lacked the intellect to be of much help. Of his critics, Smuts took little notice. Leif Egeland recalls suggesting to him after the royal wedding in 1948 that he should spend a few days in Britain relaxing with friends. "No, no, my boy," replied Smuts, "I must get back. While I'm away, none of my ministers make decisions." And as his long-standing parliamentary colleague, Major Piet van der Bijl, wrote pointedly in his memoirs, "Older men who have great intellectual qualities and are fearless and powerful are inclined, when in command, to ignore advice and resent criticism or obstruction." And haven't we seen so many examples of that over the decades? Smuts was not, according to his close colleague, Dr. Ernie Malherbe, a good judge of character either, being far too naive and trusting of others. Even Louis Botha once said that if Smuts had to choose between two men, he would invariably choose the wrong one. And his reluctance to refresh his elderly cabinet in 1948 demonstrated loyalty to old friends was often allowed to cloud his judgment. Okay, let me now turn to the question why Smuts is regarded with such condescension today. One doesn't have to look far from for the reasons, as I mentioned yesterday. In this country, neither Afrikaner nationalists nor African nationalists have any interest in acknowledging today his central role in the history of South Africa. The ANC dismisses him for being a lifelong segregationist. Afrikaner nationalists, of course, dismissed him at the time for not being segregationist enough. And with a few notable exceptions, Andrew Roberts, in his new history of Churchill being one, historians and academics in Britain and elsewhere regard the staunchly pro-imperial Smuts as representing the wrong South Africa, the wrong Africa, if you like, for today's world. It's a period, his era was a period of history they'd much rather draw a veil over. Since World War II, I don't need to tell you, imperialism, colonialism, and racial discrimination have become ever more objectionable to succeed to successive generations. As a politician, Smuts was undoubtedly a man of puzzling contradictions. I think Alan Paton put his finger most unerringly upon the central ambiguity in his personality, the conflict between his universal ideals and his cautious pragmatism at home. In his masterly biography of Smuts' protege, J.H. Hofmeyr, Paton writes with his characteristic directness that there were really two Smutses. The one, the holist and citizen of the world, the other, the Boer in respect of the racial question, who found it impossible to apply his idealism to the South African situation, not merely because the situation itself was so difficult, because of some psychological difficulty within himself. The Pretoria legal academic Willem Gravett, who has studied Smuts closely, takes a similar view to Paton's. Smuts, he wrote recently, lived on several planes. He lived on several. On the world stage, his vision was universal, his analysis acute. He displayed statesmanship of the highest character, marked by vision and courage. On the South African plane, however, he was a politician fighting for his party, seeking immediate objectives and using whatever means this came to hand. In the domestic sphere, he was reactive rather than creative. His approach to the native question, in quotes, one of crisis management, dictated by political expediency at the time rather than any preconceived plan. James Morris, in his Pax Britannica, also thought it was Smuts's boorness, and I quote him, that flawed a truly great man and kept him from the very highest ranks of human achievement. He believed genuinely in the community of the world, wrote Morris, but he could not quite bring himself, so deep were his folk instincts perhaps, to believe in the community of black and white. And yet, as the Cambridge historian Saul Dubois observes, the contradictions that Smuts had to navigate were not only personal within himself, but global. He came of age in a world where national self-determination and democratic freedoms were confined largely to whites. In the turbulent times in which he lived, good order and stability were all important to him, and what changed over his long life was not so much his own ideas as the post-war world around him. So how then does one square Smuts's racial pragmatism at home, or conservatism at home, with his insistence on protecting human rights in the UN Charter? Simply stated, it's because his conception of human rights was limited. He never believed that political, racial, or gender equality were fundamental human rights that needed international protection. His concern for human rights had grown out of his experiences in the Anglo-Boer War and 2 world wars. He envisaged the UN Charter as a means of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war, not in bringing about equality. Now, the rights he intended to protect were the right to security, to protection from aggression, to freedom of expression, the freedom of religion, and above all, the rule of law. It was inconceivable to him that the framers of the Charter could have intended to make political equality in racially diverse countries at different stages of development, such as South Africa, a basic human right. To do so, he argued, would mean the end of progress in nations where the progressive races, i.e. the uneducated masses, constituted the majority. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, Smuts claims so vehemently and unsuccessfully in response to India's attacks on South Africa's racial policies at the UN in 1947 and 48, that this country had not violated any fundamental rights within the Charter, and why he argued, along with Australia and some of the other Commonwealth countries, for the adoption of a clause in the Charter to prevent the UN from interfering in the domestic affairs of member countries. His concern, in short, was not so much to protect individual citizens from their own governments, but to keep nations safe from aggression from other states. And his failure, especially in one of such wide and universal vision, was not to foresee that human rights after World War II would be given a much wider interpretation than he ever envisaged. Though a segregationist himself, Smuts never thought the complete separation of South Africa's races, as propagated by D.F. Malan and his nationalist opponents, was either feasible or sensible. He disbelieved strongly in racial blueprints, and he thought that an imposed apartheid would be disastrous for the country. Any solution to the country's racial problems could only evolve over time. And there's an instructive example of his approach to the racial question in Terry Wilkes's biography of the veteran Natal politician Douglas Mitchell. Mitchell had taken Smuts to meet a handful of aspirant UPMPs before the 1948 election. One of them, Dr. Vernon Shearer, presented Smuts with 2 foolscap pages of ideas on how to address the concerns of voters, particularly on the racial question. Smuts listened impatiently for a minute or 2, then he interrupted Shearer and said, "Vernon, we must realize that the Almighty never intended that we should find solution to all the problems affecting humanity. We must leave to future generations the opportunities to solve some of their own problems." But the essential difference between Smuts and his nationalist opponents, however, and this is an important point, was that he always regarded black Africans as fellow South Africans, and not as some surplus people who could be hived off into Bantustans and given some spurious form of education. Smuts would have agreed with C.W. de Kiewit, our great historian, who wrote that in its various forms, apartheid is the transfer of responsibility from the living world to the dream world, a substitution of wishful simplicity for a real complexity. At the time of his election defeat in 1948, Smuts was intent on implementing the proposals of the Fagan Commission, which recognized for the first time the permanence of Africans in cities and towns, in direct contrast with the social engineers of the National Party who tried to argue that black people were temporary sojourners in what they called white South Africa. The British historian Ronald Hyams described what happened in South Africa after 1948 as a seismic shift from pragmatic, occasional, and limited measures of discrimination, i.e. under Smuts, to an ideological, unified, and systematic denial of black rights in all spheres of life, something dogmatic, rigorous, and totalizing. And for that, Smuts, who always dismissed apartheid as being a crazy concept born out of fear, can hardly be held responsible. Smuts may have been prepared to give way on what he would describe as the small things, but he refused to give way on one big thing. That was Hertzog's plea to put English Afrikaner unity above Britain's request to South Africa to help in the fight against Hitler. Smuts' understanding of international affairs enabled him to appreciate, unlike Herzog, not only the threat that the Nazis posed to the free world, but the danger that Southern Africa might fall victim to the expansionist aims of the German Reich, particularly in respect of what is now called Namibia. On more than one occasion during the early stages of the war, when Hitler appeared invincible, Herzog and Milan brought motions before Parliament urging Smuts to make a separate peace with Germany. And had Herzog been Prime Minister when France and the Low Countries were invaded by the Germans in 1940, such were nationalist Afrikaner pressures upon the Prime Minister that Herzog that he might easily have abandoned neutrality and made such a peace. The international consequences for South Africa, as you can imagine, would have been devastating. And to quote Andrew Roberts in his new book on Churchill, South Africa, had South Africa not joined the Allies, or worse, had she joined the Axis, as some Afrikaner nationalists wanted, the all-important supply of India and Egypt might have become impossible. So it's thanks to Smuts that this country was able to make an honorable contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Let me conclude. In an article in the journal American Diplomacy, the career diplomat and scholar Gregory Garland also asked himself the question that I've posed today. Why has Smuts been so badly treated by Clio, the muse of history? Garland observes that American heroes of the past, such as Washington, Jefferson, the sainted Lincoln, and much later Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and even Lyndon Johnson, all went along, as did Smuts, with the prevailing racial orthodoxy of their times, because they had to in order to be elected. Yet unlike Smuts, these icons have been able to survive assaults on their reputation because of their great achievements in other fields. The ghost of Smuts, writes Garland, must be jealous of the American tolerance for imperfections in their heroes. Here we are not. However much we may revere today the example of great liberals such as Peyton, Margaret Ballinger, Peter Brown, Helen Suzman, Beyers Naudé, and others who put the principles of non-racialism or multiracialism before any other, we have to recognize that political leaders like Smuts had to respond to the world as they saw it, not necessarily as they would have liked it to be. With his brilliant intellect and superior administrative gifts, Smuts regarded himself as the only person who could lead South Africa to international respectability. And that meant a long series of compromises. And if that meant a long series of compromises, well, the end was justified by the means. Saul de Beau, in an article on Smuts in the New York Times, a matter of just a few months ago, wrote that Smuts's long career had come to an end when mass democracy was on the rise, when decolonization was on the march, and just as political freedoms and rights began to be seen as indivisible and universal. Smuts comprehended these shifts, but at the age of 80 was unable to respond to them. I would go along with the judgment of the revered liberal academic and native representative in Parliament in the 1940s, Dr. Edgar Brooks, who wrote of Smuts that although he sounded an uncertain trumpet on matters of race, he was a great human being, gifted in everything outside South African party politics with insight, with profound knowledge and living hope, a far greater figure than many of his current critics would admit. A last word on the subject of the two great South Africans we've been discussing over yesterday and today. The Oxford scholar Anthony Lenton concludes his short book on Smuts, written a few years ago, with a comment: "The principles of goodwill and good faith, which Smuts, and here I must add Louis Botha, displayed at Vereniging, Versailles, and in Smuts's case San Francisco, and their pervasive belief in reconciliation and magnanimity, have lived on in the South Africa of today, most notably in men like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and, it goes without saying, Nelson Mandela himself." Well, may that spirit of reconciliation and magnanimity turn out to be Botha and Smuts' most lasting legacy. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm now going to show you the last 3 minutes of the...
And one may hope that we shall approach the peace much better informed and equipped than we were last time.
Right.
Certain points of great importance have already emerged. Thus we have accepted the name of the United Nations. This is a new conception, much in advance of the old concept of a League of Nations. Again, we have agreed on certain large principles of social policy involving social security for the citizen in matters which have lain at the roots of much social unrest and suffering in the past. With honesty and sincerity on our part, it is possible to make basic reforms both for national and international life, which will give mankind a new chance of survival and of progress. And may heaven's blessing rest on our work in war and in peace.
When I met General Smuts in Cairo, I labored to persuade him to come and visit us here in England. I labored hard because I saw I was struggling for a great prize. I will not detract from anything that he has said by entering upon the topics which he has covered. And I ask you, all of you, to signify your feelings by rising and giving him the acclamation which his character, his life's work equally deserve.
Some someone set the key a little high, but what it lacks in melody, it makes up for in sincerity, as the illustrious company pays vocal tribute to a jolly good fellow.
I think the next person to be given that honor was in fact President Reagan about 50 years later. I think I'm correct in saying that. So it's quite an occasion. I hope you enjoyed that. Are there any questions or comments? Sir?
I recently read the book by Boris Johnson.
Yes.
Before he became Prime Minister on Churchill.
Yeah.
And in that book, there is not one single mention of Smuts.
I know.
I found that absolutely incredible.
Well, it's not a very good book. It isn't. It's half about Boris and a lot about, of course, it's not about Churchill. But you can see Boris's motive for writing the book. You know, ladies and gentlemen, the one great thing about Churchill and Boris is that they both could inject humour into politics. What I hadn't realised until reading this latest book of Andrew Roberts's was that between when Churchill was in the wilderness in the 30s, fighting about India and fighting about Hitler and appeasement and so on. It was the days before television and before radio coverage of Parliament and so on. His talks, I mean, people would queue for tickets because this was an entertainment himself, because he was so damn funny, brilliant, disliked, all the rest of it. But he was a wonderful entertainer, and I know Boris would like to be regarded as a hero in the heroic mold of Churchill, but I think the only two things they really have in common is, apart from a superior intelligence, is the fact that they are able to make people laugh in their politics, despite their opposition to him. So there's a sneaking feeling, I think, in accepting Boris Johnson as the British Prime Minister, for all his many faults, he's going to be a blooming entertaining leader. And I think the second. But you're right, it's no mention, and I don't think it's very good history, quite honestly. So,
quickly touch on the relationship between Smuts and Gandhi.
yes, I cover it in the book on Churchill and Smuts that I wrote. Smuts, and Gandhi sparred over 40 years. First as the Transvaal, effectively Minister of Home Affairs, Colonial Secretary I think he was, and the restriction of Indians. They reached eventually a sort of compromise, the two of them. They had great regard for each other because they recognized each other's interest in spirituality. Gandhi made Smuts some sandals when he was in prison. Eventually they did some sort of deal which enabled Gandhi to say, well, I've got as much as I can in South Africa, I'm now going on. And Smuts wrote fondly that the saint has departed our shores, hopefully never to return, or something like that. But then afterwards, when Gandhi started, there was further correspondence over the whole Indian question, right up into the 1940s, and Smuts and Churchill often discussed Gandhi because Churchill did not like Gandhi at all. Smuts thought he was an awkward customer, but had a great regard for what he was trying to, and his methods, which it was new to Smuts, this satyagraha, this passive resistance, completely new to Smuts. And Smuts had got a sneaking regard for the effects which it had. And Smuts always said to Churchill, one thing you don't understand, Gandhi, you don't understand his spiritual dimension. And Churchill said, what do you mean I don't understand his spiritual dimension? I've ennobled 6 archbishops of Canterbury. Don't tell me But when Gandhi died, Smuts paid him a very warm tribute. He said, we disagreed, but he was a great man. Churchill said absolutely nothing. Not a word. He was the only world leader of stature just to really keep his mouth, say nothing. And I think that reveals the difference that the two men had over Gandhi. Sir.
We walk on Table Mountain on Smuts' path. Can you elaborate on Smuts' walking up skeleton doors?
Well, I think he did that practically every Saturday. You know, that was his recreation. I mean, the day of the war vote, no, I'm wrong. He was walking in Kirstenbosch on the day before the war vote, and the country was up in arms, wondering what on earth, how the war vote was going to go. Smuts was walking in, it was a Sunday, Smuts was walking in Kirstenbosch with his daughter, Louis. But he would, of course, he would go up the mountain. You know, he made that great speech on the mountain, The Spirit of the Mountains, which is one of the great speeches that I recommend to you of Smuts' career. So I can't tell you much more about that, except that he went up the mountain as his regular form of exercise. He loved the mountain. He took King George VI and Queen Elizabeth up the mountain. I think they went up the cable car. Smuts climbed up. And the first time he ever used the cable car was to take them. But yes, he did love them. I'm afraid I can't go into more detail than that. Sir. Yes, sir.
Was in power for 14 years and then Smuts subsequently say for 9. Did he reverse any of the nationalist segregationist policies?
No, because this was his great compromise. He had to. Hofmeyr resigned over that. Smuts felt bound by 36, and then came the war, and then after the war, I mean, the pressure, the Swart Gevaar tactics of the nationalists made it quite impossible. I mean, Smuts did anything liberal, they would pounce on him and say, here you are, he's going to sell us down the river sell white civilization down the river. It was much worse after the end of the war. But he didn't reverse anything, but what he did during the war was to take very little notice of the pass laws, for instance. He relaxed, he didn't apply a lot of the legislation. He didn't repeal anything either then, during the war, or after. But he was very much more, just carry on and do it, don't apply the law. But reversing legislation, no, he didn't. In fact, the reverse. Okay, well, thank you again very much for your attendance. Well done, thank you.